Today is the 18th of May 1985. I'm with Mr. Angelo Dougall at the Lower Baraka in Malta. To begin with, let's send a message to my father.
It's okay. Mr. York, I wish you all the very best. I could hardly believe it when your son came here to Malta, or else when he wrote in the newspapers that he's doing a research on Maltese immigration. And it dawned on me that you used to be a visitor to my landlady's and my landlord's house in Upper Holloway in London, England. I knew you lived in Finsbury, and you used to visit with your son, who was then a toddler, and I remember him since that day. Now he's grown pretty tall. I don't know how he grew so tall. You weren't so tall, I'm sure. I still remember you. I faintly remember your wife, and how you remember the Salafias in St. John's Villas. That's where we met occasionally. And then you vanished from scene. I hardly realized that you went to Australia. I suppose you did a very good step, because Australia was the country of the future for yourself and for your family. I wish you all the very best, your wife and you, and I wish your very, very best to your son here. I'm sure he will be very successful with his study of Maltese immigration. And it's very useful. It will be a very good seller, I'm sure about it, from the academic point of view. All the best.
Now, what about if you give an outline of your own past, like where you were born in Malta,
okay.
What you've done, and when you immigrated yourself.
My name is Angelo Dougall, and I was born in Senglea 57 years ago. I was more or less lucky to know the old way of life, and then the war came, and we had to move somewhere else during the war. Well, after the war it was pretty hard either to find a job, although I had a job with the government, and I wanted something better. I went over to England, studied architecture. I am an architect and civil engineer, and eventually I went to Canada. In Canada, something strange happened. I was asked to write a paper on immigration, and this is how I got involved. I didn't know much about it. I hardly knew anything about immigration or Maltese immigration to North America. I said I was asked to write a paper for a conference or a convention in 1969. I had to do that all in a huff and in a hurry. And eventually it was published by, what do you call it, Xerox type? What do you call it? Gestetner. I intend to evolve on it. I found more on that, and I kept on my research. It's very vast research. And I left it at that for the time being. I came to Malta. I worked in Canada for 15 years and also in the States on very, very big projects. I had to leave it because of my health trouble. I found Malta more health-wise better. Nowadays I just do anything, like research mainly, draw, paint, and I'm interested in quite a lot of subjects.
You mentioned the big projects you were involved in. You've mentioned a couple to me. What were they?
Oh my God, they are monsters, I call them. During that time it was the largest powerhouse, conventional powerhouse in the world. And later on I worked also on a nuclear station. After that, of course, more or less downhill. I worked on quite a lot of university campi or campuses, as we call it. We I worked on one in Nigeria. It was a present from the Canadian government. I worked on hospitals, skyscrapers galore, and God knows every project on earth.
Regarding the research I'm doing, which will be published as a book, I was toying with the idea of having an introduction that would illustrate how the Maltese have...
Social background?
An overview of how they've emigrated everywhere.
Yes.
Can you give me any examples, interesting anecdotal type of things that I could include in such a chapter or an introduction?
I think, Barry, during our conversations, you have covered most subjects. I was involved because after this project I went on doing my research in Detroit, Wayne State University Library, Burton Archives in Detroit, Detroit Public Library, Windsor University, Toronto University Libraries, all these. I made my researches there. They are all in notes. I intend to publish some of them. I came across very little about Australia. I wasn't much interested. I put on some notes about Maltese immigration in Australia, and they are not any use to me. I tell you quite frankly. I have concentrated on Maltese Canadian immigration and mainly Michigan Maltese immigrants over there. I went very deeply into it. As to the social background, we came across our symposium. We did it many often at the Wayne State University. Practically, at least I know it 4 times every year. One symposium each year. I represented the Maltese Club in Detroit. One time I represented, as I was secretary of the Maltese Club in Windsor, I represented the Maltese in Windsor too. And we entered into many discussions on the ethnic background of various peoples living in those areas. And well, I can't really explain myself any further how we could go on this subject any deeply, Well, how shall I put it about social background? We found something very peculiar, that ethnic peoples used to live in ghettos, more or less, in areas. There was the Maltese district, say in Detroit there was the Maltese district around Cork town. There was another small group of Maltese around the Holy Redeemer. There was another small Maltese group in a certain area around Dearborn Heights. Dearborn Heights is more or less what you call a posh area, where the wealthier Maltese went to live after leaving the downtown areas. We found out that as long as they kept within their ethnic area, they went on ahead. Once they went into the melting pot, it started getting wrong. Something gone astray somehow, and they couldn't explain why. Even higher authorities. Then we found out too that the first generation that go there, like the Maltese-born Maltese, they want to forget about Malta. Perhaps it was some bitter experience Malta. Either they found themselves out of work, unwanted, either sort of indirectly religious persecution. Perhaps they couldn't even get on with their families because they couldn't get on church, Then the second generation, they started getting real interested. But it was the third generation that took the greatest interest, because they wanted to see their roots, to dig into their roots. And we had, during our symposiums at Wayne State University, we had these type of third generation boys and girls all doing their research on their ethnic backgrounds, Italian, Polish, German, and or even Maltese. I remember at least 5 of them. I met, for example, a 4th generation Maltese in Detroit, or shall I say Michigan, because they lived outside Detroit city. And she spoke Maltese very fluently. I was surprised about it. I asked her, well, how did you keep your language? Well, we find pride in talking Maltese, she said. I feel to say that I'm proud of being Maltese. I used to, and other people too, they wrote quite a few papers on Maltese in Detroit and in North America. And they really found something to be proud of. Especially when they found out that even, say, the Liberty Bell was cast by a Maltese, or as I could say, 2 Maltese, as Benjamin Franklin himself has noted, 2 Maltese workers working on it. Well, what else could we...
Well, I was going to say, we're sitting here at the Lower Baraka, where you brought me the other day and pointed out where the migrant ships would leave and what the scene was like.
Mm-hmm.
Did you say goodbye to many migrants on the ship?
Oh yes, oh yes.
Post-war period?
Oh yes, I said quite a lot. I used to go to the custom house. It used to be a heartbreaking scene down there. It's best to avoid it because Maltese people are very sentimental and very, what shall I say, they cry openly and sometimes they scream and swoon, and best is to avoid that custom house or ordeal. The lower baraka and even the breakwaters used to be full of people. More or less the last place where they used to see their dear ones going away. Some families used to hire dices and other boats, and they used to follow the ship right out of the breakwater. I remember saying my grandmother did that when my uncle went to America. They hired a boat and followed the ship slowly until they gone about a quarter of a mile away out of the harbour, of the breakwater.
Were they in a dice?
Oh yes, they were waving their relative goodbye. It was a common thing to do, here in Malta.
What year was that?
When my uncle went away to North America, it was 1919, just after the First World War. There was quite a lot of unemployment in Malta. They were very busy then in the dockyard area, and then suddenly after the war there was no work. Maltese workers were very much wanted in Detroit. The automobile industry was just... Well, as I was saying, Maltese workers were very much wanted in Detroit, and Ford himself was very friendly to Maltese as a kid. He grew up in a Maltese district and played with Maltese kids when he was young, usually building up bicycles and all that stuff. It's mentioned in his biography. Now, coming to immigrants leaving Malta Harbour, it was a scene never to be forgotten. One can't forget it, especially when dear ones are leaving their home. The lower barrack especially were choked with people all over the bastions, all over the place. People used to crowd also on the breakwaters to bid their dear ones goodbye. Dices and boats used to row slowly along the ship and going even outside the Grand Harbour. I had myself relatives who emigrated to Australia. The first ones I remember were two cousins of mine. One Joe, he lives in Sydney, Leichhardt, and another one Victor. They have families there. Another cousin lived there. He's now unfortunately dead. He died a couple of years ago. He's the same age as me. There is Uncle Alfred and all his family. And there is another cousin, Victor Dougall. They all live in Australia and they all have families, happily settled there. And I'm sure...
Were they all in the 1950s? Or?
My cousin Victor and Joe, he went 1948. One of them went 1950. Quite a lot of friends went to Australia. I have a photograph of an emigrant ship, Ocean Victory, leaving the harbour. I've got also some pictures at the quay near the custom house when we had our last drink. There used to be a couple of bars there where you used to have your last drink. Nowadays they practically are closed either because the Navy is not here. Nowadays immigrants don't use ships to go to Australia or North America or anywhere at that. They just board the plane and they are off. In a couple of days they are settled or arriving in their country of adoption.
How would the immigrants get all their luggage to the ship, to the customs house?
Well, in the old days, I remember that they used to hire a cart. Say if they come from a village, they don't hire a taxi or a truck, they just call a man with a truck. They
like a
call
cart.
Like a cart, yeah, it was a cart. They put all their luggage on this cart and off they go. Sometimes either the relatives riding too on the poor mule or else other carts taking them to the customs. In my days I had a taxi or some other relative taking, bringing his car and take you to the custom house here at the customs wharf.
What about your cousins who went in 1948? Did you see them off?
Oh yes, I did see Victor off. I'm still seeing my uncle with his big American hat on, with his cigar in his mouth. But when his son went away, he just patted him on his shoulder, wish you good luck, and off quietly he went to cry. Well, I have heard stories of people going to America, either jumping ship or stowing away. I have got many stories like that in my research. I know one particular place, or two particular cases, where they admitted that they arrived in America barefooted. One of them carrying a sack on his back. Mind you, this person carrying the sack on his back, he became very, very wealthy. He owned a couple of blocks downtown Detroit, including cinemas. And he offered 2 ambulances during the war, one for Malta and one for England. And he showed me the letter he received from the King George VI.
What year did he emigrate? Or what period?
He told me, I can't remember, but I think he emigrated in 1920 or 1921. There was poverty then in Malta, mind you, anywhere. All countries had poverty then. They didn't have social services what they have now, and you can expect it. It was taken for granted.
With the post-war Maltese immigrants, what was the procedure for actually getting from the customs house wharf onto the passenger ship?
Yeah, I've shown it to you, Barry, the way they used to go. You know, they used to arrive at the custom house. They used to go through all the procedure, going through long tables and of officials, government officials, stamping passport, giving them papers. Then they used to call the dicer man. They board the dicer, sometimes 10 people on a dicer. They used to send the luggage beforehand, and off they go to the ship. Go alongside the ship, go on that ladder, the ship ladder, and wait till the ship blows his whistle, and off they go.
So you would actually see the passenger ship in the harbour?
Oh yes,
Prizes would be lined up at
lined
the wharf.
up next to them, next to the ship.
What about the luggage though? How would that be placed on a separate?
At times it used to be set on a separate boat or else on a small barge. They used to go alongside the ship, and with the gantry they pull out all the luggage up on the ship.
Would there be government officials or church leaders present to?
At first, no. I remember the early boats to Canada they didn't have, but later on they did give them social service officers to follow, to accompany them on ship, to give them advice and all that sort of procedure.
What about simply to see them off on the wharves?
Oh yes, they used to. They used to. Well, most of the emigrants had relatives who were either priests or government officials, and everybody used to help everybody else. Everybody was on the same boat, as we say, you know.
In my research, I've noticed, say in the 1920s and 30s, there was great resistance to emigration to the empire countries. I shouldn't say
there
great,
was
there
discrimination.
was that element of
yes.
resistance
Yes.
in Malta, in the domestic political scene. After the war, was there like a unanimity or a consensus?
There was, yes. There was a consensus for emigration. It was generally admitted that Malta was overpopulated. It was the most populated place in the whole world, and everybody had to admit that something had to be done, and the only outlet or safety valve for the population problem in Malta was immigration. Mind you, this has been also during the Nights of Malta. It was mentioned. I have come across it even in 1750s. I was told by a friend of mine that he has come across it also in manuscripts in the library. I have come across it in my research while I was at the Burton Library in Detroit. Burton Archives, there are very rich archives there, that I have come across a mention of more organized Maltese immigration to what is now Venezuela. And some people went there. I have also come across a request by the French Canadians to send over in the 1640s, as early as the 1640s, Maltese soldiers to defend the missions there against the Red Indians.
Can I mention these sort of things in my book, or is this research you're still pursuing that you'd rather I don't?
No, you can mention these in my book. Funny enough that this business of North American immigration, like the ones that during the French regime in Canada, the 1640s, I have come across it in the Jesuit relations, as they are called. They sent letters to then Grand Master Lascaris to send them soldiers. And I have found nothing over here. I have come across nothing over here yet about this thing. Just a couple of lines. While the ones in Venezuela, it has been published in a book which I can't recollect offhand. And I was told by a friend of mine, he does quite a lot of research on the Pinto time, Grandmaster Pinto's time, and he says that he has come across it.
Yeah.
One day I'll dig it myself, and about the Venezuela adventure, as I call it. Later on, the Brazilian adventure, it was a flop, as you might have read from
Yes.
Price's book. I have met a person in Detroit who remembers that episode very well. He was well over 90. He was about 97, and Mr. Perez. He was still going strong, carrying gun, working, driving a car. And he says that as a boy, he remembers the emigrants from Brazil coming back. And on the wharf, as soon as they stepped down on the shore, they cried loudly, kissing the ground, thanking God that they are back, because it has been recorded that quite a lot of people vanished from the scene, either in the huge Amazon forest, or they were murdered for their possessions, or like that. About immigrants vanishing, I've come across it in Canada. A whole bunch of them, they don't know what's happened to them. I suspect they went somewhere up north. I suspect a place called St. Paul, up north.
These are Maltese immigrants?
There are people with very much similar Maltese name, like Bougie and all that, like Bougie, you know. They changed names, but they kept, you know. It's very funny stories here while doing your research. Perhaps you'll come across similar stories while you are in Australia, and we would be too glad to hear about them. Yeah.
There was something else I wanted to ask you about. It doesn't really have anything to do with immigration, but it's a story that fascinates me so much. I'd like to put it on the tape. You know, when we visited the Maritime Museum, you asked...
Mr. Wickman's at Shira.
You asked
Yes.
what was the new name of his street.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Uh-huh.
I think my dad will be interested.
Eduardo Allol. Eduardo Allol, your dad must know him. He was a character. He was a man with a big heart. He helped everybody. Mind you, lately in Malta, he was he wasn't making a very good name for himself. Openly anti-clerical, which was resented very much in Malta just before he died. He has got surely his reasons to be like that. He was a great friend of mine, myself. I used to meet him quite often. Sometimes we had our arguments, you know. I used to say, Eduard, why don't you keep quiet in these last days and live in peace, you know, and to hell with everything. We have got one life to live, and let the politics to the younger people. They said, no, I want to fight till the bitter end. Well, now I'm glad that even for what he did for Malta, I'm glad that they have named a street for him. Now let's forget his late cantankerous years, as I call it. He did quite a lot to the Maltese. In London, he did quite a lot for the good of Malta. He did quite a lot for the good advertisement of Malta. He was a man of great cultural attainment. He was a poet, well known in England. Even one of the great Sacheverell's family have dedicated one book to him. He was a great character.
He
Not
passed
easy.
away recently, didn't he?
Well, I forgot the exact date, about a year ago, or about 14 months ago.
How old was he?
He was, I believe, 93 or 94. Offhand, I can't remember. They have published a book with his late writings, and one of them is, it's called The Maltese Going to Heaven with a Smile. Of course, priests in Malta, they don't very readily agree to that. Although he used to say that he was an atheist. I'm sure he was a theist at heart. But he would be turning in his grave if he knew that there was a priest giving the final rites on his tomb.
He did have that, did he?
Oh yes, he would turn in his grave because he told me point blank, I don't want any priest to bless my coffin. He told me just before he died, he says, I'm sure that they'll be ready to do it and say that I've converted. He says, I'll never do that. Mind you, a mint of praise, he says he was a very good man. That's all I can say about him. In fact, he was a very, very good-hearted man. Indeed he was.
Was he born or did he grow up in that street that they named
No,
after
not
him?
at all. In his old age, just for quiet, he had a small three-roomed house there, dingy 3 rooms, but he lived like a hermit there. He was known by the fishermen around the place, quiet, far away, as you know, from anybody. It's surprising that there is a place like that in Malta, where everywhere is reached by car, where you hear all the din and the noise of motor cars and of people all around, and yet that place is such a quiet spot in Malta.
What was the name of the village again? I forgot.
Shira.
Shira.
We used to call it Torita Shira, Shira Hazzabar, but officially it's Shira. In Maltese, in Old Maltese, Shira, it's like Sahara, it's a deserted place. In Old Semitic tongue, it is a small desert, a small, away from it all place.
And where was he actually born, do you know?
He was born in Valletta. He had a small place in Senglea. It was overlooking the harbor. Eventually he left that place because it was getting noisy. He used to blame the parents for sending kids to annoy him purposely, knowing what he was. So he went to live in Balzan in the last few years, about 3 years, and until he passed away.
Did he involve himself in the Labour Party, or was he in any of the...
In the past, yes, very much so. In fact, sometimes in England they used to call him the spiritual father of Mr. Mintoff. He resented that, in fact. Tell you quite bluntly, lately he didn't go on very well with him. They didn't get on very well together. Somehow they didn't agree on quite a lot of points. I can't mention those points
No,
yet.
that's all right.
He used to tell me those points, why he didn't agree with Mr. Mintoff.
Did you know him in London? Was he in London when you were there?
Oh, yes, very much so.
Why was he there? Why
He was High Commissioner for many years in London. Malta's High Commissioner, in fact. The British, they did like him very much, the British people, the British officials, because he was a very straightforward. He was a continental type of Maltese, you know. Very, not that the Maltese aren't straightforward, but he was more straightforward, and you knew where you stand with him. Straightforward, he would tell you off. He was very honest and very sincere person. I can tell that about him.
So he was appointed after the war, was he?
Oh yes, yes, he was. He was a councillor too for Pancras, St. Pancras State, so for the borough of St. Pancras for many years.
So he must have lived in England for some time.
All his life practically. After the First World War, he served on the Western Front. He knew French fluently. He was headmaster of the French Lyceum in London. And he served under, he helped the French administration while in exile during the German occupation of France. Yes.
What a fascinating character.
He was indeed.
So, do you know when he settled in London or in England?
He settled just after the First World War. First time I met him was about 1947 in Malta. Yes.
So he returned from...
No, he returned off and on for administration purposes.
Gee, and so he was in the Great Britain British Labour Party.
Oh yes, very much involved. He had many great friends like Krishna Menon of India. He knew many people. Many admirals, for example. Quite a lot of the Labour Party, the real top Labour Party people. He knew them very well. He, from him, Mintoff had a good backing from that point of view of lobbying for his demands. He helped him quite a lot.
When did he finally come back to Malta full-time?
That I don't know. I was away. I was in Canada then when he came. I believe he came in the 60s. Sometime around the 60s, late 60s. I believe so. I can't tell you when he came back to Malta. I was away myself.
Yeah, thanks for telling me about him. Of course, I keep thinking what a pity, if he was still alive, how great it would be to just sit down with him
and get
his whole story on tape.
You would have to go half a mile away because he used to shout when talking, and I used to tell him, Duarte, keep your voice down. I couldn't care less about hearing me even from England, as to say. I have got nothing to be afraid of, nothing to be ashamed of, nothing to hide, he says. What I talk is straightforward talk, and I know that I talk what I talk about is the truth. He was that type of character.
Did he have a family? Was he married with children?
No, he wasn't. He was a bachelor as far as I know. He has got a nephew. He is more or less following his steps, Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Is there any other recognition of him apart from that street? Naming the street?
Books. He wrote many books. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for sharing your wisdom with me. I've learned a lot from you on this trip.
Not at all. I wish there'll be of some help towards your book, and I wish you success on your book. I'm sure it will contribute quite a lot to the history of immigrants, Maltese immigrants, especially from the Australian point of view. We need that type of book, and I'm sure it will be a great success.
Thanks.
Yes.